Batya, what's on your radar?
There's a crime wave happening across America, and it's disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable Americans. It's popular among journalists on the left to point out that crime is nowhere near as bad as it was during the highs of the 1980s and 1990s, and they're right that the national murder rate was significantly higher then. But that's because crime was more evenly distributed. The 80s and 90s were dangerous for all Americans, whereas the rising crime today is hyper-localized in the kinds of neighborhoods where few journalists venture and nearly none live. As Rafael Manguel has painstakingly chronicled, the murder rate in many cities, including Philadelphia, Indianapolis, Louisville, Trenton, Memphis, and Greensboro, was as high in 2021 as it was in the 1990s, and in some cases, it was even higher. We know from the FBI's crime statistics that the majority of the victims of this new wave of violent crime are Black Americans. Crime also disproportionately impacts poor and working class Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. Meanwhile, most journalists live in the most expensive American cities and not the neighborhoods where their Uber and Amazon delivery drivers live. America's metro areas are more segregated now than they were in the 1990s, both in terms of race and income. If you're a journalist working for mainstream liberal news organizations, chances are you think the crime wave isn't real because it isn't real for you. If you're an upper middle class journalist living in Park Slope or on the Upper West Side, it's laughable to compare today to the 1990s. If you're a Black teenager living in Philly, it's criminal gaslighting not to. For too many Americans, the crime wave and the homicide spike are all too real and not going anywhere. So how do we fight it? One thing we know works from study after study is more police. Peter Moskos of the Violence Reduction Project has compiled many of these studies at his blog Quality Policing, but to give you just a taste, a 2004 study found a large deterrent effect of observable police on crime. A 2018 study suggested that U.S. cities are substantially under-policed for the goal of deterring crime. A 2019 study found that increasing police presence is effective in crime prevention. A 2012 study found that each dollar spent on police is associated with approximately $1.60 in reduced victimization costs, suggesting that U.S. cities employ too few police. A 2015 study found that policing disorder strategies had a small but noteworthy impact on reducing crime when the community was involved. A 2018 meta-analysis found the same thing. A 2022 study found that a police strike in Brazil led to an increase in homicides of between 100 and 250%. Another 2022 study found an increase in car theft and burglaries when local police stations were shut down because, quote, criminals are less deterred due to a lower visibility of the local police. And a 2022 working paper published at American Economic Review, which focused on the race-specific effects of larger police forces in the United States, found that each additional police officer abates 0.1 homicides, the effects of which were twice as high for Black victims than they were for white victims. The problem is that additional police officers also make arrests for other things other than homicides. The study found that while more cops do bring down the homicide level, quote, at the same time, larger police forces make more arrests for lower level quality of life offenses. And this can lead to the impression that Black communities are both over-policed and under-policed, something that Jill Leovy argued persuasively in her tour de force book, Ghetto Side. Add to this the defund the police movement that followed George Floyd's horrific murder and the Ferguson effect in which police pull back after situations of intense criticism, fair or unfair, and you end up with a stubborn murder spike. What's to be done? An op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this weekend argued that the U.S. knows how to reduce crime. Written by Thomas Abt, the founding director of the Center for the Study and Practice of Violence Reduction at the University of Maryland, the piece argues that a series of pragmatic, evidence-based approaches have been used to great success to reduce crime. For a 2016 meta-review, Abt and his colleagues interviewed dozens of community leaders, former gang members, cops, and relatives of murder victims, and came away with important lessons for fighting violent crime. Abt learned that most gun violence is urban street violence that takes place in small, tightly networked clusters or hotspots, and that gun violence responds to both positive and negative incentives. So how do you fight gun violence? With, quote, a focus on where violence is most concentrated, the balanced use of both rewards and punishments, and outreach to ensure that communities see anti-violence measures as fair and legitimate. In short, what Abt calls focused deterrence. Thomas Abt joins us this morning. Thank you so much for being with us to discuss this crucial topic. So my first question for you, I think the right is correctly infuriated by the way that Democrats talk about gun violence, because Democrats tend to focus on things like banning AR-15s. But as you write in your op-ed, that's really not where most gun violence is happening. It's happening with handguns, and it's urban street violence, gang violence, often in their own backyard, in places where there already are a lot of gun restrictions. How can we have a better conversation about what's needed to curb violent crime?
Thank you, Batya, and it's a pleasure to be here. Wow, I have never seen such a fulsome recitation of the research as in your presentation. So thank you for that. Just a few quibbles. The first thing is that I think Republicans sort of exaggerate how influential the hard left is on Democrats in general. The main Democrat in charge is Joe Biden, and Joe Biden has proposed billions for police and billions for community-based violence intervention. So yes, I think Democrats are firmly in support of reasonable restrictions on the use of guns, but they also have broader strategies to cut violent crime.
Go ahead, Ravi.
Yeah, so let's get more specific, right? Because we want, as Batya laid it out, we want to target violent crime. We want to deter and then solve homicides without bringing back, the kind of stop and frisk regime where, all black people in an entire city feel like they're being stopped arbitrarily and erodes, community trust, erodes trust in authority, et cetera. I think we all, many people, I think a majority of Americans find that to be too egregious an infringement on citizen civil liberties, even if the effect would be some kind of bringing down crime by some amount. So what is there a middle? What can we do without going that far ever again? Because it's something there's no public appetite for doing.
That's a great question. I think the thing to remember is that there are three fundamental principles for effective violence reduction. The first is that you be focused, meaning that you focus on the small number of people and the small number of places, as Batya said, where crime concentrates. So you don't have to be everywhere and work with everyone. The second thing is that you need a balanced set of both rewards and punishments. You need things for people to say yes to and things for people to say no to. And then finally, you have to make sure that whatever you do in this space is perceived to be fair and legitimate by the people who are most impacted. And if you're focused and you're balanced, that's most likely going to be the case. People will welcome those types of strategies.
What do you make of what is being alleged, at least, to be happening in some cities? I think Philadelphia being one example, where prosecutors are at least being accused of, not prosecuting gun crimes, illegal for repeated felons to still have access to guns, that kind of thing. If it's not being prosecuted, they're being put back on the street, and that is being alleged to be a driver of the increase in crime there. And as Batya said, the increase in crime in Philadelphia actually is pretty staggering compared with the rest of the country. Is that a fair charge based on your research or your knowledge of the situation?
Well, I think there's two things going on there. I think one, yes, Philadelphia could have more aggressive policies in terms of people who are arrested and charged with gun offenses. But there's also just a broader issue there, which is that the leaders in Philadelphia are really struggling to get along. There is a toxic political environment in that city and in some other cities that you mentioned, where the people are going to political extremes. And the important thing for the public to recognize is that fighting crime and violence is a team sport and involves enforcement, but also non-enforcement. And if people who are on the team can't get along, the team can't win. And so there's at least two things going on in Philadelphia.
You interviewed hundreds of families of victims of violent crime. What do they want? Give us a sense of what they told you.
I think what I've learned, speaking with victims of crime, speaking with people who live in these impacted communities, is they're much more pragmatic than folks on either the hard right or the hard left. People who are removed from this problem. They want relief, and they want relief now. And generally, what they want is a sort of anything that works strategy. So, are they frustrated with police abuses and overreach? Sure. But do they want police in their neighborhood? Yes, they do. Do they want more supports and services? Yes, they want that too. Do they want investments in their community in terms of jobs, better health outcomes, better education outcomes? Yes, they want all of that. And so I think that, unfortunately, what we see is people who are on the extremes and who are not close to the problem are defining it as you can have one thing or you can have the other, when in fact the people closest to the problem want a sort of both-and conversation.
How would you respond to something I hear a lot of progressives say, which is that, well, let's shift funding. Instead of funding or having more funding for law enforcement, let's have funding for mental health professionals who could intervene in these situations, or I guess housing, or the other kind of package of progressive concerns or progressive solutions for making the lives of people better. The shifting of resources in that direction is something that I hear a lot from people on the left that we have on the show.
Sure. Well, I think those people have it half right. We absolutely need to invest in community-based solutions, in better mental health, and other supports and services. But where they get it wrong is they suggest that it's an either-or conversation and that we have to cut funding for police. This is not the right time to cut police. As you heard, there's a lot of evidence that shows that more police can effectively reduce crime. There's also a bunch of evidence that shows that it's not the actual number of police that's most important, but using the right strategy. So I don't think we know what the right number of police is right now. But it's certainly not a good idea to create a hostile environment where these people who are supposed to be working together are now competing for funding. So let's invest in both police and in prevention.
This is like one of the most measured and important conversations I've ever had on this topic, which we talk about a lot because it's so important. One last question for you. One thing that I find so frustrating about this conversation around crime is that leftists seem to think that it's racist to talk about crime because so much of it is localized in low-income Black neighborhoods, when to me it seems like the opposite is the case. It's deeply racist not to talk about it because you're essentially sentencing the people you most want to help to just live with it. I guess my question would be, aren't you worried that a method that I think would be effective, your focused deterrence idea, that this will be a hard sell to Democratic polities because they are so worried about this question of race and crime and talking about it?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think progressives are worried that these discussions can stigmatize poor people of color and paint them all with the brush of being violent. And that's certainly not the case. But it's also important to realize that you put anyone in these circumstances, you put anyone who suffers from the legacy of, invidious racial discrimination, segregation, disinvestment, and all of those things, and add that up over generations, and there's going to be social dysfunction. We see that in non-Black communities as well. So I don't think we need to be afraid of this conversation as long as it's framed well. And the other thing is it does a real disservice to these communities, because what is one of the biggest racial disparities? The racial disparity in violent victimization. And so those victims need support and assistance as well.
Thomas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.